everyone. Hello again and welcome to the lodge. Before we begin this meeting, just a couple of technical points from last month. Brendan, our really good tech guy, had a problem with the sound last month and I didn't realise. So we were a little late in starting, but this month everything should be perfect. So we're happy to have with us this morning Dr. Steve Aiken to talk to us about his days as a nuclear sub-commander. So we'll give him a warm welcome, please. But first of all, would you all make sure your phones are switched off? Whoa. Thank you. So a warm welcome for Dr. Steve, please.
First things first. Oh, that sounds very loud. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. For those of you who lead particularly sad lives and might have been watching the Northern Ireland Assembly yesterday, somebody turned around to me and said, "Oh, couldn't hear you very well." And I said, that was lucky, because if you actually listened to what I was saying, you wouldn't have wanted to hear it anyhow. My name is Steve Aiken. I'm going to talk to you for about 25 to 30 minutes. And I'm going to talk about my life and how I ended up where I am. But because, and I know that some of you are inflicted with what I call Nolanitis in the morning, when sometimes you listen to the Nolan show and think, what is going on in Northern Ireland politics today? It would be remiss of me not to answer any questions you want to put to me, because we are in a rather strange set of times and circumstances. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions that are put in my general direction. The only difference is if you ask me any questions about my naval career in the Royal Navy, I'll give you straight answers. And if you answer any questions about politics, you'll get a politician's answer. But there you go. Sorry, you invited me, that's it. So you. I just put that there so it doesn't go. I hope you don't mind, but I'll walk around a bit. And I know sort of the tech people are trying to sort of make sure that I'm in glorious technicolor for going forward. I know people would go, oh, stop moving around, all the rest of it. But I'm here to talk to you and talk and tell you a bit about my life and how I ended up here and why it's, to me, I think, the journey that has been taken and where it is, I think it's probably what you really want to hear. And it's the question of how did a young lad from Newton Abbey in Carnmoney end up being a nuclear submarine captain, and through a rather circuitous route ended up sort of standing here as a politician in Northern Ireland as well. And it's been an exciting journey. It's been a journey that I think I have thoroughly enjoyed every single moment of it. And apart from a couple of the political things, I have absolutely no regrets at all. But how did I end up in the Navy? And what was the idea behind the Royal Navy? When I grew up in Newton Abbey, my mum came from, and she's a member of u3a, so I had to put a sort of a real plug in for that as well. My mum's from Carrickfergus, and I was always involved in sailing. Not that I particularly liked sailing, and I'll be honest with you, I'm not. The Royal Navy have a terminology for people who spend their time in yachts. It's WAFI, it's wind assisted, I'll leave the F bit out, idiot. And to me, I could never work out why anybody would want to spend their time in what is basically an afloat caravan. But I enjoyed the sea. I enjoyed the adventure of the sea. And when I was about 12 or 13, I think, we were sailing off what is now Kilroot. And I looked from on this reasonably sized boat I was on, and I looked out and I saw a periscope. And I thought, wow, a periscope here? And everybody, I just said, oh, there's a periscope over there. And most people laughed at me. And then about 20 minutes later, the submarine surfaced slightly further out, Round Class, out beyond Blackhead. And from that moment, I had this excitement about the submarine service was something a bit different. So I thought, you know, I don't really want to spend the rest of my life in Northern Ireland. I want to go and see the world. I also wanted to be a pilot. I had all these ambitions that were inside me. Unfortunately, when I was at Belfast High School, I sort of thoroughly enjoyed sort of all my up to my O-level time. I had a lot of time sort of, and I did reasonably well academically. And then when I sort of reached the tender age of 16, I discovered three things. One, quite frankly, Smithwick's and harp. Two, girls, and three, punk music. And having discovered all those things, the one thing that I didn't really spend much time doing was doing my academics. And I sort of managed to get only a couple of particularly poor A levels. And I tell this story because one of my daughters, who was not doing very well at school at the time, and I said to her, I said, Ruth, so you got to really buckle down and work at school, or else you're not going to be able to get to university. And she just looked at me and she said, Dad, and I knew what was coming, but she said it anyhow. Dad, when did you get your first degree? When I was 38. When did you get your second degree? When I was 42. When did you get your PhD? When you were 45. Okay. And which university did you get that in? University of Cambridge. So are you telling me that you actually gained or lost by not doing all your work for your A levels? And I had to think about it and said, well, don't do as I do as I tell you. Which was good news because she ended up getting the first from university anyhow and is now a school teacher in Edinburgh. But I thought then, in those years of 17 and 18, 78, 79 in Northern Ireland, you know, I wanted to see the world. I didn't want to be defined by where I was. And I saw the only route I could get out was to join the armed services. So I applied to join all three armed services, the Army, Navy, and the Air Force. I did all the interviews for all three of them and actually got shortlisted for all of them. I'd also, during this time, as a member of the Royal Navy Reserve at HMS Caroline, which was an enormously successful way to go out for a pub crawl every weekend in a different part of the United Kingdom, which I again thoroughly enjoyed. And I thought, whoever wrote back from the three services, I would join. And the Royal Navy wrote back first. And then at the age of 18, because my birthday is in June, at the age of 18, I went to Britannia Royal Naval College in Dartmouth. And last year, we had our 42nd anniversary of that entry who joined in Dartmouth. And when we arrived in Dartmouth, I imagined myself as being a young sort of 18-year-old, fit, ready to go and do everything, which I was. When I arrived in Dartmouth last year, at 59-year-olds looking around everybody, I said, who are all these gray-haired old men standing beside me? Until somebody showed me a photograph and showed it was all of us. But we all felt that spirit of adventure because it was a very adventurous time. One of the first things we did is we did our initial training. So we ran up and down Dartmoor. One of the reasons I also wanted to join the Navy was because I thought, being the Navy, that there wouldn't be as much sort of physical exercise as potentially the Army. And I wasn't quite sure what the Air Force did. I don't think anybody's really sure what the Air Force does most times. And anybody here from the Air Force, I can guarantee that that is indeed the case. And the one thing I didn't realize, because I hadn't really spent a lot of time in England, obviously, is I had this rather naive assumption that Devon is basically flat. It's not. And Dartmoor is very hilly. And yes, I did run up and down most of those hills. But then sort of in the January, I'd only been in the Navy about 4 or 5 months. We set off on what I would call our first, the Dartmouth training ship, which was an assault ship, HMS Intrepid. And off we sailed around the Caribbean for 4 months. For a young lad from Belfast and who'd only been in the Navy, actually being on what is quite frankly a government-sponsored holiday for 4 months around the Caribbean was absolutely outstanding. We went to Barbados, we went to Antigua, we went to Bequia, we went to Aruba, we went to Curacao, we went to Puerto Rico, we did the Turks and Caicos Islands. And to do something like that at the same time as being paid for it. That was a real life's adventure. But of course, while we were at Dartmouth, you know, we were learning how to be naval officers. And everything we were taught there and sort of the basis from that is something that I've kept throughout the rest of my life. And it's all about leadership. It's all about commitment. It's all about loyalty. It's all about those sort of aspects that makes you want to be a Royal Naval Officer. And it is a connection with the past and the heritage of it, but it's also the connection with the future. And the thing I found more sort of every single time you did something in the Navy, you realized it was linked to something, both to the future and to the past. And that really came to the fore in 1982, which obviously was the Falklands War. Now, I arrived 2 weeks after the war was over in the Falklands. I was particularly glad about that because I was on a Type 21 frigate, HMS Amazon, which was the sister ship of the Ardent and Antelope. And anybody who's aware of that happened in the Falklands, and we're coming up to the anniversary fairly soon. Actually, Antelope and Ardent were not particularly good warships. And what happens when you make a ship full of aluminium? When it catches fire, it basically melts. And to be in, for the first time at the tender age of 20, in a war zone, in something that was basically a floating death trap, really concentrates the mind. And having been there just after the war was over, and you could still see there were still the remnants of a ship sitting like a V shape like that. We were still clearing up after the Argentinians. We're still having to clear minefields and the rest of it. And it just brought it home to me that, you know, this wasn't a game anymore. This was actually it was a profession, but it's something that I wanted to do, and I wanted to devote the rest of my sort of adult life to. I also discovered fairly early on I wasn't going to be a Sea Harrier pilot, which is a bit of a surprise to me because I thought I was quite a good pilot. I could fly Chipmunks, I could fly sort of Gazelle helicopters. I did all the initial flying aptitude test. But as was pointed out to me when I did my first aircrew medical, they said, the problem with you, Steve, if you want to be a Sea Harrier pilot, if you eject, you're not going to be 6'2" anymore. You're going to be slightly about 4'3". So I thought at that stage, I'm not going to be a fast jet pilot. So what do I want to do? When we were in the Falklands, about a couple of weeks afterwards, we were told to sail way out to the west. And way out to the west is a euphemism for we had to go very close to Argentine waters. And there was still a period of conflict going on. And we were told that we had to go out and deliver some vital stores to a submarine, one of our own. And we were told to go to a particular position. We had to switch off all our radar, all our lights, be at this exact position at 7 minutes past midnight. Not at midnight, not at 10 minutes past midnight, 7 minutes past midnight, because that's when we were going to do this rendezvous with a submarine. Now, my captain on HMS Amazon was an aviator, and he was enormously skeptical about the Royal Naval Submarine Service and what they were going to do. But as a young midshipman, as I was then, I was in charge of the upper deck guns. And as we went closer and closer to the Argentine coast, you could actually see the lights twinkling in the far distance. We got into position, and exactly 7 minutes past midnight, we stopped on where it essentially was X marks the spot. And we all stood around thinking, yeah, what's going to happen here? And at exactly 7 minutes past midnight, the whole bottom of the ship was lit up. We looked down, and a submarine was directly underneath us at that time. It switched its upward-looking spotlights on, eliminated the bottom of the ship, switched them off, moved off to the side, surfaced, and we transferred the stores, and the submarine was gone in under 5 minutes. And I went, how cool is that? That is James Bond writ large. I want to do that. Now, speaking as somebody who's been in command of 2 nuclear-powered submarines, I can assure you that was a complete and utter fluke. And the number of times I have had to go and do rendezvous with ships or special forces or pick up secret agents or whatever happens to be, the one thing you can guarantee is that you will be there on time and they won't, or they'll be there on time and you're still stuck in port somewhere. Those are the kind of things. But that was the thing that drove me and said, I want to be a submariner. And in our class, when we came back, we did the Officer of the Watch class. During the Officer of the Watch class, everybody was saying, and this was just after the Falklands War, what did everybody want to do? And the number of people who wanted to be in the submarine service had gone up from about 5 or 10% to virtually everybody wanted to be a submariner. But I was lucky, I was selected. The terminology in the Navy is normally volunteered, but I was quite happy to go and do it. And that started my career in the submarine service. I had a fantastic 26 years in the Royal Navy Submarine Service. I did things that a couple of years ago I'd be quite happy talking about, but about 2 years ago I was in Warsaw giving a talk, quite one similar to this, and we were talking about what was going on in the world and what was happening in the Baltic. And I started my talk off and said, there I was, less than 20 years ago, I was a young officer sitting in the Baltic at periscope depth, watching what the Soviet Navy was doing and all the rest of it, keeping a close eye on it. And at the end of the talk, a guy came up to me and just tapped me on the shoulder and said, Steve, and I said, yeah, I'm so-and-so from the British Embassy. I said, oh, yeah, good to meet you. I said, yeah, see that talk you gave? He said, yeah, don't do it again. Because as you know from the international situation now, we're back to where we were. And I would normally say about sort of my career in the submarine service, I would have explained in the past about, how we'd be chasing Soviet submarines, how that we would be the distance between here and sort of the end of that passageway would be as close as sometimes as we got. I would talk about how we would have been under the ice, sort of hunting between ice keels. I know it's not like Hunt for the Red October, and it's definitely not like HMS Vigil. Trust me, it is not like HMS Vigil. Somebody from the BBC rang me up and said, can you come on and talk about HMS Vigil? I said, yeah, happy to. And he says, what do you think of it? And I said, it's a complete load of round spherical objects. I said, you can't say that on the air. And I said, why? It says, well, because it's very accurate. It says, it's not. It says, the reason why it looks like the inside of a warehouse, because you filmed it in the inside of a warehouse. It is nothing like what being in a submarine is like. But when we went out, and this was the thing about really struck me about the submarine service, and you actually see advertisements in the television now that's making a virtue of it about trying to get volunteers to come and join the submarine service, is that we can't tell you what we're going to do. We can't tell you where we're going. And when we get there, we'll make sure that nobody else knows what we've been doing. And that sort of summed up basically a quarter of a century what I had to do. I operated in the Pacific. I operated in the Indian Ocean. I operated far too long in the Middle East and in the Mediterranean. I operated in the Atlantic, in the Arctic, and the South Atlantic. I was away for quite long periods of time. The longest I ever served dive, because that is always a question, was 105 days underwater. What were the biggest limiting factors we have in the submarine is underwater? The biggest limiting factor is the food, because we make our own water, we make our own atmosphere, we deal with all the carbon dioxide, carbon monoxides, and everything else. You go around with what is essentially a very large power plant that can move you through the waters at speeds maybe up to 40 miles an hour at depths that I can't discuss. And we can operate sort of globally. We can go very close inshore, we go into very deep water, we can do all different sorts of things. And that's what we did day in, day out. And what it was about was making sure that our country was kept safe. And many of the things that we did, are quite difficult to explain because, again, we're now moving into that era. But one of the things we used to do is we used to go and listen a lot to see what other people were doing. We observed what other people were doing. The good thing about a submarine is that you can deliver people in a way that nobody's going to know that you're doing it, and you can pick them up again. And all those things we did time and time again. And for a young lad from Belfast to be able to be involved in that, I think was, you always knew that you were doing something different. And I used to come home at weekends, because I always kept a home here in Northern Ireland. I used to come home at weekends, and you would go to the local pub, and people would say, where have you been? Says, don't know. Can you tell me what you did? nope. What have you been doing? Can't discuss that. And just occasionally, something would happen that people would be aware of. A submarine would come back that hit a whale. One that's probably about 150 meters long, that was covered in anechoic tiles and made in Murmansk. But those were some of the things that we did. And that kept going until, of course, we reached sort of the 1990s and what was the end of the Cold War. And it was also an interesting time for me because not only had I sort of enjoyed my time in the submarine service, I was particularly lucky in that the submarine service looked after me well, and trained me well. And they said, you're good enough to become a submarine commanding officer. And that means you have to go and do the submarine commanding officers course, which is known as the Perisher. It's known as the Perisher course for a very clear reason, because of 10 warfare officers who join the submarine service, only 3 will actually get on to the submarine commanding officers course, and only 1 will probably pass. And the failure rate for the submarine commanding officers course has remained the same, and you don't get to do it again, because that's it. You fail, you're out of the submarine service. And for people to put themselves through that, because you're paid, I said, I used to laugh when I was working in the Ministry of Defence, and I said, I'd love to be a captain of an aircraft carrier, but I couldn't afford the pay drop, because as a submariner, you're obviously paid more for your extra skills and all the rest of it. And when we did the submarine commanding officers course, that was one of the things that was always there. And to add the frisons to it, because my teacher at the time said we were divided into 2 groups. There was a group that went to sea on a nuclear submarine and a group that was sent to sea on a conventional submarine. And because we had sort of Dutch and Australian and Canadian students on it as well, it was mixed and matched. So the whole idea that we'd have the same sort of training course. So somebody from my background who spent most of their time on nuclear submarines, was very used to operating nuclear submarines in all different parts of the world. My teacher, senior naval officer, just turned around and said, Steve, you've done very well in the first half of the submarine commanding officers course, so we're sending you to sea on the Dutch submarine Dolphin. And I went, what? Sorry, I don't know any Dutch. He says, don't worry, they all speak English and you'll get on with it. It's about your command presence. You'll be able to do it. So I did probably the most intensive and stressful course that there is in the British military, the submarine commanding officers course on a Dutch submarine, HMLS Dolphin. I can still speak quite a few words in Dutch. Mostly they're very rude. And I had a great time during those 5 or 6 weeks. It's like taking the submarine to war. It's like a war patrol. And having been in quite a few hairy situations in other parts of the world, in the Baltic and the rest of it, I really enjoyed the experience. The most interesting thing, though, happened right at the end, and it taught me a lot about myself and also taught me an awful lot about future lessons for life. During the absolute last run that I was doing during the submarine commanding officers course, we were in the Clyde, and on the last week, they don't try and mess you up because you've demonstrated you could do everything, but it is the last intensive course. There were 2 frigates were going around, pinging around the Isle of Arran, trying to find me. There were 5 helicopters that were dipping around, trying to find me. They were dropping depth charges, simulated depth charges all over the place. And the only thing about simulated about them was that there were slightly smaller charges than real depth charges. I had to go right into the entrance to the Clyde, where there was very limited navigation. There was not a lot of water under the keel, and there were fishing boats everywhere. And you weren't allowed to go any closer than a fishing boat than 1,500 meters. And on top of that, being a conventional submarine, its battery was quite low. It only had 20% left in the battery. And at the end of my run, which was to take 6 hours, I handed it over to the next student with enough battery capacity so we'd be able to do it. So I had to creep around at very slow speeds. And right at the end, I made a mistake. I made a very bad mistake, and I could have put the submarine in danger. But at the last minute, I thought, no, this doesn't feel right. I'm going to turn around, take the submarine out. I failed in my run, but I kept the submarine safe and the rest of it. And my teacher, a guy called Chris Munns, came to me afterwards, and he said, Steve, and I thought, that's it, I failed. And he says, what did you find out about that run? I said, oh, I messed it up. He said, Steve, you've got to learn something. He says, look around this control room of this submarine. And there were 20 very experienced Dutch and other nationality submariners there. He said, there's only 2 people in this submarine know that you messed it up. You and me. There is nobody else in this submarine thinks that you did the wrong thing. Matter of fact, they would follow you to hell and back. You have what it takes to be the commanding officer of a submarine and take it to war. You've passed the course. But, he said, here's the thing you've got to learn. People will follow you regardless of what is happening. So you need to be very, very careful in what you do because you have leadership and leadership ability. People will follow you. Now, people will follow you regardless because they think you know what you're doing. You and I both know on that occasion you didn't. Do not forget that lesson. And admittedly, it probably costs about £5 or £6 million because that's how much it costs to put a student through the submarine commanding officers course. That is a very valuable life lesson that I have never forgotten. Because just because I think I'm right doesn't necessarily mean I am right. And that's one of the things that I think is lost quite a lot today. If we look at not just sort of people in business, but indeed people in political class as well. So after that, I sort of then commanded 2 nuclear submarines. You'll have all seen me, hopefully the TV program has disappeared off the edge of the world. But I ended up, because I was from Northern Ireland, BBC Northern Ireland wanted to do a television program about a Northern Ireland submariner. When it was pointed out that they actually, not only did they have a Northern Ireland submariner who actually lived in Northern Ireland and was spoken a reasonably Northern Ireland accent, they wanted to come. I said no, I didn't want a TV crew anywhere near me when I'm trying to drive a submarine around the world. And they said, wrong, and says you don't have any option because when you're in the Gulf War, you were one of the talking heads in Sky TV and the rest of it. So yeah, you have to do it. So anyhow, I did it. I had the TV crew with me for about 2 years on and off. They produced 4 TV programs. And even now, I can safely say I have never watched a single minute of those programs, and I have no intention ever of watching it, because it just demonstrates to me how the difference is there between the reality and sort of how things are portrayed. But during that period of time, I was commanding officer of then the oldest nuclear submarine, HMS Sovereign, that was at sea. It was a real struggle to keep her going. And at the end, when I finished and I left HMS Sovereign, I can safely say I was absolutely exhausted. But I'd had a really busy couple of years, because one of the things I did, and sort of the Navy select people fairly early on, somebody identified that, bearing in mind I had 2 very bad A-levels, and at Belfast High School, sort of the headmaster didn't think I would amount to anything. Somebody in the Royal Navy said, we're going to send you to the Advanced in Command and Staff course. I went to the Advanced in Command and Staff course in Shrivenham. I did, quite frankly, I did very well at it. And actually, when I came out of it, I was appointed to what was then the Maritime Battle Staff. This was leading up to 9/11. And when I was in the Maritime Battle Staff, obviously 9/11 happened, and then everything thereafter leading up to the war in Iraq. Bearing in mind, if anybody listened to Tony Blair, and he is not one of my favorite prime ministers by any stretch of the imagination, if anybody listened to Tony Blair, when he says that we only decided to go to war sort of 2 to 3 weeks beforehand, I can say, well, I was embedded with the US planning that war for 2 years before that happened. I worked with CENTCOM. I spent a lot of time in the Middle East, far too long in the Middle East, and that's what I was awarded the OBE for, because it was for planning for the sort of the war in Iraq and what was going on in Afghanistan. And that was the first time I really questioned sort of the whole Royal Navy. I never questioned the Royal Navy, but when politicians decide that they want to use military power for their own aims and own objectives and haven't thought it through, that to me shows a real danger. And putting politicians in place who previously would have supported CND or troops out or something like this, And they're always the ones who are the first ones to resort to using military force. And I think that is fundamentally wrong. And the war in Iraq demonstrated to me that something was wrong with the disconnect between our nation and its use of the armed forces, and particularly our political class. And if you would have told me then that I would have ended up as a politician, I would have not only laughed at you, I would have sort of chased you out. But that started a journey in a way, because after I left command, I went to Cambridge. I was selected again, bearing in mind, apparently I don't have any academic ability, but somebody said, oh, we're going to send you to Cambridge to do an MPhil in international relations. I went to the University of Cambridge, absolutely outstanding year. That sort of links up with my sort of 4 months spent in the Caribbean as the second best government sponsored holiday that I've ever been on. It was extraordinary, but it really sort of opened my mind. And when I was there, they said, well, actually, you've done very well on the sort of the MPhil side of it. Do you want to turn that into a PhD? And I'd never thought of it before, but said, yes, I'll do a PhD. So I did a PhD in international relations. And apparently I'm a world expert on India and its use of military power, which means that it means me perfectly qualified to become a politician here in Northern Ireland. And then during my latter period of time in the Royal Navy, really surprising, having sent me to Cambridge, started me down the PhD route. The Navy sent me to the Ministry of Defence, to the Joint Doctrine Concepts Centre. It's a really fancy name, but I worked for the Global Strategic Trends Programme, and our job was to look at what was happening in 40 years. And we did a lot of stuff about climate change. When I started, I was a bit of a climate change skeptic. After 3 years working with the science, having been in the Arctic, looking what it happens to be, not only to become a convert, you know, I am driven by the biggest challenge we have at the moment is the climate emergency. It's happening, and it's happening fast. And the one example I would do and talk about it, and I try and say this as an audience as well, because some people will say to me, oh, it's not really happening or whatever it happens to be. When I was in the Royal Navy, we spent a lot of time in the Arctic. And I remember operating in a particular area off the north east coast of Greenland, where there was 1,000-year ice that was in some places 30 to 40 meters thick, even thicker. Back in 2007, I flew up again, actually in a Norwegian aircraft, courtesy of the Norwegian government and the Norwegian Air Force. And we flew out over the same area at the same time of the year. It was open water, gone. Spent a lot of time in Svalbard, in Spitsbergen. And one of the things they did was they decided they wanted an international seed bank, which meant that it would survive. And what they would do, they would bury it in the permafrost. They would put a big tunnel in the permafrost, because obviously that will remain cold for the next 1,000 years. It'd be a good place to put all our seed bank. So we'll have a seed storage thing. It's now melting. Permafrost is melting. And that's in the space of less than a decade. And that sort of really, and all those things together meant that, you know, the world was changing. And I suppose I was changing too. I'd been married before. I had 2 kids. I got remarried, started off another family when I'm in sort of my late 40s. People said to me, is it easier second time around? I said, I don't know, because the first time around I was mostly at sea. So I got to experience all the sort of new things again. The one thing I do learn from sort of one of the childcare trust courses, that everything I learned way back sort of 15 years beforehand was wrong, because it was exactly the opposite of what we were supposed to do. And after that, I thought, I just can't. I ended up working with London, helping write something called the National Security Strategy. And that was the end of the David Cameron. That was the end of the Gordon Brown, David Cameron era. And I think I became so cynical, is probably the right word. So cynical about what was going on, I realized I couldn't continue to do this. And I always remember what my teacher told me about being in the submarine, about people will follow you regardless. And I always said I would never stay in the Navy when I turned out to be that person who would sit in the corner of the bar and go, it wasn't like this in my day. I said I would never turn into that person, because people like that affect people around them. And I realized I was turning into that. So I left. And I applied for a job to be the chief executive of the British Irish Chamber of Commerce, something completely different, based in Dublin. And to my surprise, I got the job. And for 3 years, I was very involved in promoting British-Irish trade, the €1 billion a week worth of trade that goes back and forth across the Irish Sea. And I spent a lot of time in Dublin, I spent a lot of time in London. I spent a lot of sort of work improving relationships across these islands. I was very involved in the complete alphabet soup of the British-Irish Association, British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly, all those things as well. And everything was working to improving relationships, because I think that is vital. Because you will hear me say time and time again, it's about making these islands work, not an island, islands. Because if anybody think that our problems can only be linked to one island, that's not the case. We need to work on an islands process. And I do remember I think it was in sort of April 2014, I was at Windsor Castle. I had been presented to Her Majesty and the Irish President, and I saw all the sort of politicians from across these islands sitting there drinking champagne, getting on with each other. The stories that I could tell about that night were legion. And I do remind some people about them even to this day. And I walked out onto the grounds of Windsor Castle, and it was a beautiful evening. And I just looked up and, you know, having had several glasses of champagne and me just finished, and we just heard the sort of the guards, bands playing, doing Beat the Retreat. And I just said, you know, what could possibly go wrong? Brexit, of course, and then we ended up in where we are at the moment. I then left the British Irish Chamber of Commerce. I was headhunted to go to be a chief executive of a university in Dublin. I was at Dublin City University, and DCU. I think, is that me? I think that's probably me feedback. I'll move over here so it doesn't do that. I was at Dublin City University, and I was living in Dublin, but I then started going back to Northern Ireland to commute, and everything, you know, when you're paying more for childcare than you're paying for the rent, and the rent is €2,000 a month, you realize something has to change. And I was very well paid. And I said, no, I've got to try something different. I'm going to actually try and make something better. And my wife said to me, you know, you're complaining about the health service, you're complaining about schools, you're complaining about this, you're complaining about that, because I had two older daughters and I got two younger daughters. I just said, I need to do something about this. And she said, stop complaining about it, go and do something. And I said, well, I feel drawn to one or two things. I feel drawn to the church. And she just laughed at me because she's a preacher's daughter and said, no, under no circumstances whatsoever, you're going to be a minister. Or politics. And Mike Nesbitt invited me at that stage to come and get involved in politics. And that is how I became a politician. And I think at that stage, because I think now I've probably spoken slightly longer than I should have, that is me and that is my story. So please, thank you very much indeed for listening to me. Please fire any questions you like at me. And I promise if they're about the Navy, I'll answer them. If they're about politics, I'll give you a political answer. Thank you. Yep.
They will unmute us. They've unmuted now.
I will say this right up front, that Boris Johnson is not my favorite politician by any stretch of the imagination. I think that there has been a huge abrogation of leadership. The United Kingdom is a much better country and doesn't deserve being saddled with Boris Johnson. I think, and I know, I've met him. Oh, that's you. I'm sorry. Yeah. I've met him quite a few times. He is not a clown. This is the thing that you all need to know. He is very intelligent. He is absolutely ruthless. And he does everything and it's planned to the nth degree. It might sound like a bumbling idiot. He's not. And what bothers me more than anything else is that he's looking to exploit what is a really dangerous situation. Look, Putin has been putting pressure on Ukraine for quite a long time. Unfortunately, we're also saddled with a US president and Joe Biden, whose comments have completely undermined the West's approach to dealing with it. Because the one thing that history should have told us is you don't appease bullies. And Putin knows that he's got a window of opportunity to achieve something. Anybody who's been a student of military history will realize that he's got until March to roll the tanks, because otherwise the ice melts and it's just a big bog. So they won't be able to do anything until sort of dries out again in sort of the early summer. We also know that with the Russian conscript system, that they'll have to let go their conscripts towards the end of March anyhow. So we know there's a crisis that is coming. And the fact that all the West had to do was stand together and say, no, you're not going to do it. Instead, all this piecemeal approach is pathetic. And it really bothers me that, you have the Germans and the French are undermining the overall effort to try and do this. What will happen, I've no doubt, is there will be a concession made, Putin will grab it, and then we'll be back here again in 2 years or wherever. What happens when it happens to Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania, which are part of NATO and are indeed part of the European Union? What are we doing about that? Many of you will know that Simon Coveney and I quite enjoy each other having a spat at each other quite regularly on media. There was a big thing recently in the Irish media about how, Irish fishermen had forced the Russian Navy to go further out to sea to do their exercise. And I did say, look, you're just being absolutely ridiculous. It means the ships will move 10 miles in that direction and that's it, done. But it says there will be a cost. And the cost was the letter that arrived in from Russia to the Irish Republic and just basically said, you behave yourself, don't join with everybody else or else. And that is the kind of thing that's going on at the moment, because people are not sort of knuckling down to do it. Look, Boris should step aside. He's undermined our nation. And I speak, when I was the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, I chose health, not because it was the easy one of the things to do, because it was the difficult one. And you should have seen the look in Robin Swan's face when he came out the door, when I told him he was going to be the health minister. Because I went in the door and he thought he was going to be the agriculture minister, but I'm glad he isn't, quite frank. And he came out and said, you're the new health minister. And we did that because it was a difficult decision, but we didn't know about COVID. All the things that's happened with COVID and how we did, and the fact that the mismanagement in Whitehall can be led at the desks of Boris Johnson and the people around him. I used to work in Permanent Joint Headquarters. We produced plans. We looked at all sorts of things to do with pandemics. We had a plan to deal with SARS. We had a plan to deal with MERS. We had them all on the shelf. We exercised them regularly. And when this happened, I just said to Robin, oh, we'll take Plan Woptic off the shelf, and that's what we'll do. Because, that's what will be at the Cobra meeting. They didn't. All the team and everything they had with them, they let them go. There was nothing, there was no strategic piece about it. So Johnson has to go. But as to the question about the Ukraine, it's not helped by everybody sort of rubbing their hands and saying, it's not really that important. It's extraordinarily important. Because unless we deal with Ukraine, unless we stand up against Putin, and I can guarantee my phone's going to be hacked as soon as I get home now. Unless we stand up against it, we're heading into a world of hurt. And to be quite frank, I'm not convinced that we haven't already started on that journey. Okay. Sorry about that, but sometimes I do say things that are, people go, ooh, but I'll be honest. Sorry.
Can I just interrupt? A grey Nissan. It looks like Note. I don't know. I can't read the writing. MRZ 2382. Your door is open. MRZ 2382. And also, Brendan has some online questions as well.
She's the chairman now.
I've been wondering what her name is. Is it Claire Carter? I know she put herself forward.
The question is, are there long-term mental or physical health problems encountered by those concerned in submarines?
That's what did they say about 3 Mile Island when it happened? Is it too early to tell? Generally speaking, no. However, most of us suffer from things like back problems and other things, because it is actually, you think about it, you're always stuck inside a metal tube, but it is very physically demanding. And I suppose one of the things that I've discovered as I've got older, and I've got more back problems. I try and walk generally about 3 or 4 miles a day, but sometimes to do with that. But I think one of the other issues is, and it goes back to the days of the old people in who served in conventional submarines way before us. And they started doing studies on old submariners, and they couldn't find many. And one of the reasons for that was because of what the problems with atmosphere control. So one of the reasons why now we spend so much time in modern submarines that the atmosphere is kept within very strict limits. And it's to do with carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and other gases within the system. So that has been the key deliverable and what has changed. The other thing is lifestyle. Submariners always had a reputation for working hard and playing hard. So a lot of the playing hard lent itself to excessive use of alcohol and other nefarious activities, never drugs, but all the other kind of stuff they used to get up to. That is one of the things that is now being addressed, because you can't be in charge of a nuclear power plant with, as I used to say, look, I'm in charge of £500 million worth of equipment, and I'm responsible for the lives of 140 people. It's not like running a factory. You take basically a submarine to sea, you deliberately sink it, you have a nuclear reactor in it, you've got high pressure air in it, you fill it full of high explosives, you fill it full of fuel that's self-oxygenating that won't go out. You deliberately put it in harm's way. And bearing in mind, it's built by the cheapest contractor who has BA systems where you couldn't trust as far as you could drop them. So what is not inherently dangerous about being in a submarine? But the one thing that gets over it is the dedication, the skill, and the training of the ship's company and good design. So actually, long-term health problems apart from bad back, no. As towards mental issues and the rest of it, no. I think generally speaking, we are a very tight bunch of comrades still, and to this day, we regularly have, we have a very strong set of friendships. And I always say I've got 4 or 5 really good friends, but the 4 or 5 really good friends I have from the submarine service, they're there, full stop. And we rely on each other. And I think that the sense of training, the sense of discipline, but the camaraderie helps a lot in a way that some other ways of that helps deal with a lot of the mental health issues. Yeah. Okay.
With the microphone. William has a microphone so we can hear better. Thank you, William.
My question is just really one that I just want a bit of history on. Now, a short history lesson. Had you been appointed the commanding officer of a Type 23 frigate or a Daring class destroyer, for example, you'd have been in charge of a ship. But the submarine service is known as a boat.
That's right.
Why?
Because when submarines were first introduced into the Royal Navy, and it was the A1, it was the Holland class, because they were roughly the same length as a ship's boat, as it was then. So they're always known as boats. And they're always known slightly rudely as pig boats, because the only people who'd want to go to sea in a submarine was pig. So, and the name stuck. And the other thing about it is in obviously the Germans, and particularly the Imperial German Navy when it started, undersea boating. So it became boats and boots, as in the German BOETS. So it stuck. And I mean, I always used to laugh when somebody said to me, he said, "Oh, you're only in command of a boat." I says, "Yes, but my boat costs £500 million. How much does your boat cost?" Yeah. That's the short answer. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. My name's John, and as a schoolboy teacher, I lived on the Firth of Clyde, and I could see the submarines coming down from Faslane, whatnot. But the only time I was ever in a submarine, it was a beached one in Labo in the Kiel fjord in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And you could climb up steps to go inside it. And as soon as I entered into this U-boat, I thought to myself, the terminology iron coffin did spring to mind. Extremely cramped conditions. Now, I firmly believe that obviously modern submarines are a lot more comfortable, this, that, the other. But what I was going to ask you really was, what did you feel serving in a submarine you were deprived of, if anything, as opposed to serving in a surface ship?
Absolutely nothing. Friends of mine, it might come strange, I actually do have friends of mine who are in surface ships. And they used to say, I remember when I joined the Maritime Battle Staff, I joined HMS Ark Royal at the time. And that had been the first surface ship I'd been on apart from the Lawrence Roar ferry. And so I was like 30 years. And I went on board and somebody said to me, oh, you much prefer being on here because, you know, you can dress for dinner and you can do this and you can do that. And I said, no. I said, it didn't have the buzz about it, didn't have the sort of drive about it, didn't have the sense that something's always going on. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to say unless you've actually served in the submarine, but you feel as if you're connected to the boat and the boat is connected to you. In a way, in a surface ship, you're just standing there. And I mean, I don't think I did. And look, people said to me, said, oh, you know, I remember my friend went, well, I've seen all these different parts of the world. You know, what have you actually seen in the submarine service? So there's the difference. I don't go as many foreign ports as you do. But when I pull into a foreign port, there's a chap there who's handing me my keys to my hire car, the room, my hotel room where I'm going to stay. And the supply officer is giving me 100 quid a day to go and spend on whatever I want. So to be honest with you, I'd rather do it the submarine service way than actually poverty way on being on a surface ship. So that's, you know, that's always the argument between the two. No, I don't think I missed anything. Yeah, I love my time in the submarine service.
My name's Tom, and it's slightly related to the last question. It's more a strategic related question. You used very deliberately the phrase making our islands work. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, in the light of that, given the fact that in Scotland, there is a present devolved government who are hoping to get independence and to be able to exercise a non-nuclear friendly policy that Faslane will go, for example. How do you foresee making these islands work in the context of Scotland becoming independent? And also particularly, how do you foresee making the training of submariners within the Royal Navy work in that context?
First thing, and I'll make a declaration of interest here. I've got lots of friends in the SNP, strangely enough, I do. I've known them for a long time, but also having been based in Faslane for most of my naval career, and having one daughter who lives in Dundee, and the second daughter who lives in Edinburgh, who's married to a Scottish international rugby player, I can say quite categorically I've got a pretty good handle of what's happening in Scotland. It's not going to happen. I think it's receding. And I think to a previous question, the quickest way to make it recede is get rid of Boris Johnson. Because there is, if we had another referendum in Scotland, I think the result would be exactly the same. Probably a bit more towards staying as part of the union. And there's, for a whole variety of reasons, that is, it could be, you know, fear of pensions, National Health Service, all those sort of reasons. But the other reason, quite frankly, is the SNP have been in power too long, and they're not delivering. They're not delivering in healthcare, they're not delivering in education, and they can't make the trains run on time. So, you know, for all those reasons, it's not going to happen. And that's not just me sort of saying this as a unionist politician. I know it's not going to happen. For the Royal Navy, though, sort of the Scottish training areas are absolutely vital. But there's something, and I talk about the islands piece a lot, and I try and explain to people, because I see it from a maritime perspective, the interconnection, integration, and interdependence across these islands. And I say, if you ever get out a maritime chart and plot out in it all the cables, all the gas pipelines, all the links, all the things that go back and forth across these islands, you realize that we are much more interdependent than we've ever been. And indeed, the climate emergency has meant that instead of us looking east-west or sometimes south, there's a real northern dimension now we need to consider. And indeed, many people in sort of Scotland are now beginning to understand, you know, with the opening up of the Arctic, you know, the fact that before long there'll be shipping lanes coming across in the summer. There was nearly that this year. You know, the influence of China. And I've said this time and time again to people, says you don't have to worry about going to China to be influenced by China. China's coming here. China is here. And we are going to see more and more of that. And for the Royal Navy, obviously, the north of our nation is absolutely vital for what we need to do for that security aspect of it. It's the deep waters off Scotland. It's the air bases. Lossiemouth, we have invested close on, sound like a spokesman for the Ministry of Defence, caveat, I am not. We have invested close on sort of £350 million in developing Lossiemouth. We have spent billions buying new maritime patrol aircraft. We have spent an awful lot of effort in making sure that we get back that capability of what we're trying to do, and we're doing it. So as to the question about Scotland's independence, no, don't see it happening. And tell you what, the quickest way to stop it is get rid of Johnson, because by which he had such a, anybody here like Marmite? Yeah, I don't. There is such a Marmite effect about him that actually if you switched him off and took him out of the equation, it would be transformational on a lot of these issues. But that's my personal political opinion. I hope you got that, Mr. Johnson, seeing that recorded on YouTube. All right.
Ultimately, a question about you went into the Navy to see the world and then went into the war.
The question was, I went into the Navy to see the world, but went under the water. I've seen an awful lot of the world. I've seen a lot of the world that people, I might have, probably more accurately, I've probably heard and been to parts of the world that other people haven't been to. I've been to the North Pole, surface at the North Pole. Couldn't have done that if I hadn't been in the submarine service. I spent the Indian Ocean. I visited lots of ports around the world and different places around the world. I would thoroughly recommend anybody who wants to see the world to join the Royal Navy. It has, no matter what part of the service you are, you will see a sizable chunk of the world in your naval career. And as I say, the nice thing about doing it in the submarine service is that somebody always provided a hotel room for me when I got there, which was really nice. Sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was just wondering with your remarks about China, what do you feel about Taipei at the moment?
The interesting thing about the sort of what's going on in Taiwan and sort of the relationship, it's very clear that the current Chinese leadership, they see it as a historical thing that needs to be corrected. And the pressure that they're putting on with sort of missile tests, flights, all the rest of it, it's all part in sort of ratcheting up the process. But it's also about testing Joe Biden, because Joe Biden, by just as one statement he made about Ukraine, it said to everybody, here's a president who's not interested. And the absolute disgraceful way he pulled out of Afghanistan. You know, they only had 2,500 US troops in Afghanistan. And the thing that has never been explained was 4 months before the United States announced it was going, it told all the contractors who were managing the Afghan army's aircraft and its tanks and everything else to get out of the country because they were leaving. So they told the Afghan army they had to buy all this sophisticated American equipment like Black Hawk helicopters and Tucano aircraft from Brazil, but the most sophisticated versions of it that could only be maintained by US contractors. The Afghans wanted to buy Russian stuff, which you could basically fix with a hammer. They were told they couldn't. So when the American contractors pulled out, and people say, why did the Afghan army collapse? And why did they do that? If you take away all your support and all your contractor support, there's nothing you can do. That was a fundamental failure of American leadership. And if I was in Taiwan right now, one thing I would be doing is making sure that every piece of equipment I had at least 6 months worth of stores in Taiwan, and I didn't have to rely on the US for anything. And the lesson is there, you see it everywhere. You see the same lesson in South Korea, who've now, unbelievably, have now developed their own ballistic submarine. South Korea, not just North Korea, South Korea has done this. The Japanese are investing heavily in their military capability. The Australians are going to build nuclear submarines. All this because of sort of the failures to do that. And so that's, and my concern is, as we're all these things, what I call is the law of unintended consequences. Because we always presume that these people, everybody thinks that everything is strategically well thought out. The one thing I can tell you, I'm being party political here, the one thing I can tell you as a politician in Northern Ireland, there are very few people who have actually thought out the intended consequences of what they're doing. What we've already heard today. There is none of this long-term thinking, and the law of unintended consequences is out there. I'm quite worried about what's going to happen in Taiwan and what the impact it's going to be.
Thank you. Brendan has another question coming
Steve,
over the.
Another question coming from the Zoom attendees. Do you think the Tories will dispose of Bojo? And if so, who might come next?
Well, the answer is, do I think, or should they? The answer to the should you is yes. The problem is that what normally happens with my short experience of being a politician of 6 years and a bit now is the one thing I've always found about the Conservatives is they're absolutely ruthless. And when they decide to do something, they do it very quickly, or it's already been pre-managed. They know he needs to go. They just don't know who's going to come after him yet. And that's because there isn't a natural successor. And whereas Rishi Sunak could do the job, he'd probably do the job very well. He is a billionaire. He will not connect with the people to that degree. Liz Truss is very populist, very able, very capable. But again, where's, what is the ideology behind her? But you got to remember when Margaret Thatcher went, sort of somebody nobody even considered, John Major, was plucked out to be put in place. And they plucked him out to put him in place because everybody thought they could control him, which they couldn't. It's actually the same thing that happened with Margaret Thatcher when they put her in place to lead the Tory party. Everybody thought they could control her. Big mistake there. That is probably what's going on behind the scenes now. And I think we're in the, honestly, I think we're in the end game because if it goes on much longer, I mean, all this, one of the things you do is, the media only report about 10% of some of the things that are out there. And if any of those sort of other things that are out there are actually true, I cannot see how he can possibly survive. But the other issue is, I can't see how, bearing in mind what happened. And to me, the epitome was it, there was their image of Her Majesty sitting in Windsor in the chapel, surrounded by nobody. And that bunch of clowns in the Cabinet Office in Whitehall were having a party, 2 parties. If that does not say there's something fundamentally rotten at the core, I don't know what does. But that's my personal opinion.
Any more questions? William? He's coming.
Yeah.
Back. He's running. Hey.
Oh, sir.
It's very simplistic, my question. First of all, I think it's been a fascinating talk, and I love your take on politics. My question is a very simple question about females. Are there any females actually as submariners? Is it they're not held back because of physical or in your experience, are there people, females leading in the submarine world?
Yes.
And you're father of daughters, and are you encouraging?
Well, one of my daughters wants to be a space science astronaut, and I think I'm quite encouraged because they've got tri-nationality. So of course they're also Americans as well because my wife's American. So we took her to Huntsville, Alabama. So she wants to be a NASA astronaut. So I'm encouraging her in that. And if that doesn't succeed, I would be more than happy for her to join any of the services but do something that's interesting. Yes, there are female submariners, some very good female submariners. Actually, one of my long-term friends was a Norwegian submarine captain, and she was the captain of u3a and u3a. and was just as professional as everybody else. And I think it's a great career. It's very arduous. There's no two, and again, that's one of the things I do say, because I try and give lots of talks to schools and talk about politics and the rest of it. But always at the end of it, somebody comes up and says, "Oh, what's it like in the Navy?" And you always know when somebody says, "What's it like in the Navy?" They're interested in the service. And I will always be a strong advocate for the Royal Navy and everything that it does. I said, "Well, what are you interested in?" And there's this girl said to me, said, "Well, you know, don't really know, but I'm really interested in diving. So why don't you become an MCD, mine clearance diver, or whatever it happens to be?" And she said, "Yeah, but if I can't do that, can I be a submariner?" She says, "Of course you can." And I said, "What's it like?" So I explained the length of training and sort of how arduous it is and all that sort of thing. And she said, "Well, thanks very much indeed for that, because it's given me food for thought." Now, I know she's in the Navy now. I don't know whether she's joined the submarine service or whatever happens to be, but that career is open to her, as is flying F-35 Joint Strike Fighters. There are a couple of female fighter pilots in the Navy. There are female helicopter pilots across the board. There are a couple of very good female commanding officers. Some of you will have seen the TV program about HMS Duncan or whatever happens to be, you know, outstanding. Doesn't matter what sex or gender you are, it's how good you are at your job. That doesn't, you know, the sex and gender bit irrelevant. Doing the job right is what's required. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Steve. That was excellent. But there is a
So I need to
third,
stop slightly
No.
away, but as you close, we were
Oh,
getting the
sorry.
feedback.
there is a third way to see the world, you know, and that's on a cruise ship.
Oh.
And I can highly recommend that. But thanks very much. That
Thank
was
you.
excellent. Thank you. It's good, isn't it? Oh, I'm still switched.